It is hump day, and that means it's Trump Day. And our Trumpologist is Dr. Andrew Phillips, Associate Professor in the School of Government and International Relations at the University of Queensland. Good evening.
Pleasure to be with you, Kelly.
Let's get right into Space Force, shall we? Vice President Pence, following Donald Trump's lead, has announced the president's desire to create a separate branch of the US military by 2020. But this one won't be fighting any battles on Earth.
Now the time has come to write the next great chapter in the history of our armed forces, to prepare for the next battlefield, where America's best and bravest will be called to deter and defeat a new generation of threats to our people, to our nation. The time has come to establish the United States Space Force.
What is this Space Force?
Well, I must say that I'm excited by it, Kelly.
Well, that's good.
Yes.
Should we all be excited by this?
Look, the idea is potentially laughable in presentation, but serious in substance.
Okay.
So the idea behind a Space Force is, and the issue here is that the United States is already working on these kind of capabilities.
And has been for a while now?
For decades.
Okay.
In some capacity. The idea behind Space Force primarily is, and the classic line is to defend, deter and prevail in the space domain. What does that mean? Well, main thing that what they're talking about there is, in the first instance, protecting United States military satellites from being potentially disrupted or destroyed by an adversary. Now,
is that a palpable threat?
Yes.
That's a true, real threat?
Yeah, so this isn't the imaginings of the Donald. This is something that the United States military has been planning for some time. We can go back as far as 2008, and the Chinese developed a prototype, what's called an ASAT, an anti-satellite killing weapon. So the idea behind it would be that you want to make sure that in the opening moments of a military confrontation, say between the United States and China, that the Chinese don't have the capacity to essentially pluck out the eyes and ears of the United States military by disrupting their satellite capability in space.
Can America do that to the Chinese military satellites? Do we know if they have the same technology?
That's the entire idea behind Space Force. And the reality is that satellites are extraordinarily delicate. It takes a great deal of effort and time to get them up there and keep them in the right orbit. So it's not easy to disrupt them, but it's certainly something the United States takes very seriously. Partially it's about protecting their own satellites. Partially it's about, and then you've got this formulation that Pence refers to in the grab of deterring and defending. That's very much out of the Pentagon playbook of saying space is going to be a domain that we will dominate in, potentially for defensive purposes. In the longer term, potentially also for developing offensive capabilities, space-based weaponry in the atmosphere.
In that particular quote, Pence used the words best and bravest.
Yes.
And that to me indicates some sort of sending up of people. Why would you need to be brave otherwise?
This is true.
Is there any real... Do we know if this would include sending people up into space, or would this just be tech-on-tech battles, really?
At this stage, primarily it wouldn't require putting space warriors up there into orbit. The primary focus of space as a military domain, as I said, it's about defeating and disrupting the satellite-based capabilities of others, and also potentially, and we've got to keep in mind that this is not a new idea in its essence. People with long memories will go back to Ronald Reagan, his Strategic Defence Initiative.
Yep, Star Wars.
Otherwise known as Star Wars, which is all about the idea of having space-based interceptors to disrupt the flight of what at the time was Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles. So if you're an advocate of Space Force, you'd say, okay, look, it's not necessarily putting people up in space with laser guns, although as a sci-fi nerd, I'd say that would be pretty cool.
We're all waiting for it.
But yeah, it's going to be about being able to develop capabilities to shoot down missiles, to increase the United States invulnerability, for example, to a missile attack from North Korea, for example. So Space Force, in some respects, it's all things to all people. The last thing to note, though, is that, and this is where there's been a bit of Donald and his friends are great salespeople. The reality is there already is, in functional terms, a Space Force as part of the United States Air Force already. They already have 30,000 people working in this field and developing these kind of capabilities.
30,000
That's right.
people.
So there are already tens of...
That's a mighty little Space Force they've got going there already then.
It is. I mean, the bigger concern, though, and this is something that a number of critics have raised, is to say, well, the great danger is that you are essentially militarising the final frontier. Mm-hmm. You're turning space into another warfighting domain. Now, if you're an advocate of something like the Space Force, you'd say, well, better that the United States gets in first and gets ahead of Russia and China than anyone else. So it's got the kind of classic Donald Trump hyperbole. And there was this terrific website link that they had, which was pick your preferred logo for the Space Force.
Yes.
If you clicked onto it, it actually took you through to a page that provided you with the opportunity to put money in for the fund to re-elect Donald President 2020. So there's always a degree of electoral politics in this as well. But you get past the headlines, and a lot of these ideas have been percolating in the defence establishment for a long time.
And of course, have they named Australia's space agency yet? There was a push for Australian research in space.
I believe it's called Space Force Junior.
The acronym spelled ARSE, which I thought was pretty funny because, well, why not?
Well, as our former Prime Minister said, we are at the arse end of the world.
Well, he did, one of them.
Funny thing, though, that you mentioned that, and this is just to close out the discussion on that.
Yep.
Any United States Space Force capability would be heavily dependent on assets and tracking facilities in Australia. So we would be all the way with Donald Trump if Space Force comes to fruition in 2020.
That's why Pine Gap's sitting there, isn't it?
Exactly.
Let's get to a Trump underling being fired. Her name is Omarosa Manigault-Newman, and she's now being sued by the White House. Omarosa is formerly of The Apprentice and more recently a communications specialist in the White House until she was fired. She recently released a book in which she claims that Donald Trump used racist slurs on the set of The Apprentice. Now, this is a little bit complicated because who is saying what? There are accusations going back and forth.
Yes. So the short version of the story here, I think, begins and ends with the fact that Omarosa has a book on sale with the less than flattering title Unhinged, about her year or less in the Trump White House. The basic essence of the story here is that you've really got a perfect nemesis for Donald Trump in the form of a vengeful former employee who also happened to be a very well-known villain in not one but a number of reality TV series. So, for example, she also featured in Celebrity Big Brother at one point.
Did she?
Yeah, so she has quite a background in that kind of reality TV firmament. And essentially, look, the accusations that she's made here, and she's extraordinarily media savvy. So her first degree was in journalism communication. So this is someone who is very, very good at what she does. Very similar to Donald Trump in that they both have a very strong mastery of the news cycle and how to manipulate it. A number of claims that she's made. One of the more fascinating ones was that the president allegedly has a tanning bed in the White House. So we're talking about this level of...
Does anyone doubt that? Isn't that a given?
We are talking about this level of puerility at one level.
I'm not even sure that's even in our top 20 things of
that's right.
What Donald Trump might have in the White House.
But I think the one thing that has been most serious and has certainly hit the strongest nerve with the Trump White House is her accusation that there is a tape from the set of The Apprentice, so going back to Donald's years as star of The Apprentice, where he is alleged to have used the N-word.
Yep.
It's important to note that Omarosa, in her book and in the publicity for it, does not claim that she heard him use this word. He has responded in a number of tweets by saying he doesn't have that word in his vocabulary. What we've seen, though, over the last couple of days, and keep in mind that the president is on holiday, so he's taking valuable time out from his golf to tweet in response, has been a real rhetorical escalation between them in terms of this dueling communications battle.
And every tweet he sends in response to her puts her book sales up too.
That's right. And as a terrific salesperson and media spin person, it is ostensibly a win-win. I think the issue, though, is that it does create or perpetuate, if you like, a wider perception of dysfunction around the White House. I mean, this is very tabloid, very tacky stuff. It must be said that the optics of it are not going to change anyone's mind either way if they're firmly committed for or against the president.
He's now, Donald Trump is now taking legal action through Hulk Hogan's lawyer,
Yes.
Charles Harder.
Yes. Well, this is interesting in that it's Donald is no stranger to litigation.
No, loves it.
It must be said. I think probably the thing that is really quite fascinating to note as an observer of the Trump White House is that really this is a story that could and probably should have been killed with silence from the White House. That you've clearly got someone
unlikely.
who is, and she has a very interesting background, Omarosa, in that in an earlier incarnation, even pre-Apprentice, she used to work in the office of former Vice President Al Gore.
Really? How did she go there?
Well, it's an illustration of her political trajectory of going from being affiliated with the Democrats to. She didn't go so well. The accusation that was made by some of the people that did work with her was that she was the worst hire that they'd ever made. So clearly what you've got here is someone who is quite a polarising figure. The bigger issue, though, is that, and of course, the great catalysing story behind this is that she has been very clever and very skilled in selectively leaking out tapes to the media. One of them is a tape of her being fired by the White House Chief of Staff, which disturbingly enough was recorded in the Situation Room, which is meant to be the most secure part of the White House.
Unless you take your phone in there and you've got a recorder just on as part of an app on your phone, you would think that would be somewhere where you just couldn't tape someone.
Well, this is true, and she's been quite cagey and also quite clever in not disclosing how she did it. But one would assume that that's how it was done.
Yep.
So it does raise, again, kind of raises that sort of perception of the security problems in the White House that this might be representative of.
Well, look, let's have a bit of a listen to Omarosa. She's talking here. Responding to news of that lawsuit on MSNBC.
It's interesting that he's trying to silence me. So what is he trying to hide? What is he afraid of? If he hadn't said anything that was derogatory or demeaning to African Americans and women, why would he go to this extent to try to shut me down?
Should he be afraid of more tapes that you have in your possession?
I think he should be afraid of being exposed as the misogynist, the bigot, and the racist that he is.
This is strange to me because there is nothing that she's saying really that I would have put in the, oh my gosh, that's shocking new information that somebody has put out about Donald Trump. These sort of accusations, these sort of tapes have already been out there for a very long time. And as you've said, it makes no difference really to his supporters still love him. I suppose we'll find out how much they still love him in the midterms, which are very soon. And those who loathe him still loathe him. So
that's right. Look, I think probably apart from the sort of fascinating circus-like element of the story, I think there's probably two things that are interesting to keep in mind. One is that, and I think this is why it's attracted a lot of attention, is that President Trump has got a fairly high turnover of staff. He's fired a lot of people. What's interesting is that most of them have actually gone quietly and either remain acolytes. So we've got our good friend Sean Spicer, who still describes Donald Trump as, I think it was a unicorn riding a rainbow.
Yes.
Or others, Rex Tillerson, former Secretary of State, that haven't spoken up.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, Omarosa was of a much lower profile, but you've got a classic story here where this is one of the few people who was playing a very savvy media gamer, saying, look, here I am, and I'm able to kind of give the inside word on the White House. So it's kind of a bit of scurrilous scuttlebutt that will, in her case, I suspect she hopes to mainly sell a whole lot of books.
Now, the president, as we've mentioned, went on Twitter, where else, called Omarosa a crazed, crying lowlife and a dog, which is the word that has caused the biggest kerfuffle on Twitter. Those words prompted this question to Sarah Sanders at a White House press briefing.
Is this any way for a president to talk about any American, let alone somebody that he hired and made the highest ranking African-American woman that served in his White House?
I think the president is certainly voicing his frustration with the fact that this person has shown a complete lack of integrity, particularly by the actions following her time here at the White House.
It's a new normal. Can you imagine if any other president, be it Obama, be it Clinton, be it Reagan, be it whoever, called somebody who'd worked in their office a dog?
That's right. And I think the optics of it are particularly bad given that there is an acknowledged and widely recognised problem that the Trump White House does have a diversity problem. That Omarosa at that time was the highest ranked African American within the Trump administration. So it's not a great look from that front. I think politically, though, the other problem is that what these kinds of issues do, and this is where she's been very clever. This is someone who goes back a long way with Donald Trump in terms of their time together on The Apprentice. So she knows where to hit him. She knows where to antagonise him. That's great for her in terms of selling books. It's terrible for the White House in terms of enabling the president to be distracted and focusing on this as an issue and saying what are some fairly unbecoming and unpresidential things in a way that actually does detract attention from the agenda that he's trying to promote.
All right. It's an iconic American motorbike. Sound of a Harley. It's not bad, Dr. Andrew Phillips.
I can see it clearly appeals to you a great deal,
I like
Kelly.
the sound of a Harley. It's not bad.
I've never really thought of President Trump, though, in the context of a motorcycle. Maybe a sidecar, maybe riding side saddle to Kanye West, but he doesn't really strike me as a Harley rider himself.
No, well, in case people are wondering why we're talking Harleys, it seems they won't be getting the president on board for a ride anytime soon. What's going on?
Well, the issue here is that in June of this year, Harley Davidson made an announcement that they were planning on relocating some of their production overseas. Now, the way that this was presented is that they were quite direct and have been direct in subsequent public statements in attributing this to the effects of Trump's trade war with the European Union. So the European Union, when Trump slapped tariffs on aluminium, steel, a variety of other products from the European Union, they said, okay, well, at the moment we've got a tariff on Harley-Davidson motorcycles at 6%, we're going to raise that to 31%.
Which is a bit of a killer.
Yeah, particularly, and this is something that is, it's an iconic American brand. It goes back to 1903. Sales for Harley-Davidsons in the United States peaked quite some time ago. So they're increasingly reliant on selling motorcycles to overseas markets.
Yes.
And the argument that they've made is to say, well, in order for us to actually do that, in order for us to actually kind of get around these retaliatory tariffs, this is what we're going to need to do.
The president claims Harley owners are going to boycott the firm. Any evidence that is actually what's happening?
Well, apart from a fairly direct statement by the commander in tweet, not really. But I think the telling thing is that it was, and this is actually, it's a real testament to, I think, his political instincts, Donald Trump, that the CEO of Harley-Davidson felt the need to actually release a statement explaining his position to his employees in order to try to present an image of saying, look, we're a great patriotic American company. We don't like having to do this. The very fact that the CEO has felt the need to do that is a really strong reflection of the fact that, boycott or not, there is a perception that the Trump's attacks are damaging the Harley-Davidson brand.
Yeah. And I suppose if you're the CEO, you're thinking, well, I'm actually trying to, and if this is true, he's trying to save their jobs, save his company, but save their jobs at the same time.
Yeah, and there's been actually a really unusual alliance here where Donald Trump has actually sided with unions who have said...
What?
I know. Who would believe it? It's a very un-Trumpian thing to do. But has sided with unions who have said, look, these plans to relocate production overseas were in train quite a long time ago.
Yep.
Harley-Davidson is trying to manipulate this as an issue. Another testament to the political smarts of Donald Trump is that, and I think, we often have fun on the program, but we've got to credit him. He's as canny political operator as they come in many respects, despite the lack of discipline on social media.
But even that might be canny.
Yeah, this is a company that is headquartered in Wisconsin, which was one of the battleground states that Hillary never visited in 2016 and that Donald picked up by about 20,000 votes, and that's what got him over the line. So he's really being able to use this iconic brand, basically leveraging the publicity that they already have, but is as a way of energising and mobilising that working class base and doing it in a very strategic way that resonates with particularly important battleground states.
Joining me this evening on Trump Day, Trumpologist Dr. Andrew Phillips, Associate Professor in the School of Government and International Relations at the University of Queensland. With Kelly Higgins-Devine, it's 8 on ABC Radio Brisbane and Queensland. And just while we're touching on tariffs, they're having an effect on US-Turkish relations.
Yes.
High tariffs on Turkish aluminium and steel, sending the Turkish lira into free fall and enraging the Turkish President Erdogan.
This is correct. And the Turks just today have announced retaliatory tariffs against the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So
on which products?
This is primarily on automobiles, but also on alcohol, which you wouldn't think would get a huge amount of effect in a Muslim-majority state.
But it might.
On the other hand, Turkey, until very recently, was a militantly secular state as well. So
it was.
Possibly. The really interesting thing here is, and it's worthwhile keeping in mind, that the Turkish state, Turkey is very strategically important. Economically less so, constitutes about 1% of the total global economy. So it's not a China-style powerhouse. The issue here is really twofold. One, Donald loves his tariffs. So this is in part an extension of what has been going on already. But the real issue here, and again, it sort of touches on his political smarts, there is a United States-born pastor, a guy called Andrew Brunson, who is currently under arrest in Turkey under allegations that he was involved in a failed coup attempt against the Turkish president back in 2016. And this is an issue that is very dear to the hearts of the evangelical base. Vice President Pence behind the scenes, who's obviously a very religiously devout person, has taken this cause up himself as being very, very important. So part of what's happened here is that the tariff policy has been implemented in a very direct attempt to use economic coercion to shake up an already really fragile Turkish economy in order to secure the release of this American pastor.
Is that likely to happen on your reading of what's going on now? Or is Turkey likely to dig in and go, do your worst?
In the short term, the interesting thing here is that Congress was keen to actually slap down Turkey before the Trump administration embraced it. In fact, which is very uncharacteristic of the Trump administration, but they were initially a source of restraint, of saying, look, we think we can try to deal with this. They've obviously decided that path has not been working, has not been producing results. Look, the likelihood is they're already beneath all the froth and the headlines. The pastor has already been released from a Turkish jail. So he's currently under house arrest. And there is, which is, I think, quite a fascinating dimension to it, there is a potential trade in the offing. There is a Turkish banker with close connections to the Turkish state who is currently in prison in the United States as a result of financial crimes. So there's an expectation that if there was a quid pro quo, then that might potentially happen. The big issue in the meantime is that before that deal is struck, there's potentially huge economic fallout as a result of this.
For Australia at all?
Well, potentially. And this is where it's one of the really fascinating and horrifying things about studying the impact of tariffs on the global economy at the moment is that I mentioned Turkey by itself is not a particularly large economy, but there are several really important French, Spanish and Italian banks that are really heavily exposed to the Turkish government. So the potential risk here for Australia, it seems like it's a stretch, but there's a very strong possibility that continuing economic turmoil in Turkey has a negative knock-on effect to the European Union. And from there, we have a contagion that then filters out into the financial system generally. It's worth noting, finally, that the Turkish lira is obviously in free fall. The perception at the moment is that because there is such a high degree of economic uncertainty in the world at the moment, that people will retreat to investing in what they see as safe assets, which are typically US government bonds, which is why the US dollar is going through the roof. And by contrast, the Australian dollar is falling against the United States dollar. So it's one of those things where you think, well, this is what seems to us to be a very obscure kind of dispute that involves this pastor who may or may not, but almost certainly didn't have involvement in a coup attempt in Turkey 2 years ago. But because of the way that the financial system is now so well integrated, this could potentially have negative effects for us in Australia.
All right.
I don't come bearing many cheerful bits of news.
Not really, But that's okay.
Look,
It's always interesting.
International relations scholars, we're like intellectual undertakers. The worse things get for us, the better things get.
Better things get for you. That's it.
Exactly.
Dr. Andrew Phillips, Associate Professor in the School of Government and International Relations at UQ. Thank you very much.